Welcome, everybody. We're just going to give people a few more minutes to join here. We'll kick things off in about 2 minutes there. So just stand pat. All right. Well, let's get going. It's 10:03. We'll let some of the latecomers come on in, and hopefully they don't miss too much. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is the first in our series of webinars that's focused on Microsoft Defender and Sentinel capabilities. The first in this series is focused on Microsoft 365 Defender, specifically within the context of investigating threats. So some of the newer capabilities that are there within Microsoft Defender and how you can use Microsoft Defender to investigate threats. The next in the series of this webinar will focus on Sentinel in combination with Defender, and then the last will be focused specifically on orchestration automation, leveraging Sentinel for both Defender and Microsoft Sentinel. So that's where we are. My name is David Hazard. I'm in the Senior Manager of Executive Tech Strategy here at CDW. So my primary focus is on bringing to the market new services, whether that's managed or professional services, specifically for our customers focused in security. Microsoft security is one of the areas of my focus. And again, we're just going to kick things off. It's going to take probably the full hour to get through everything what we're going to cover today. However, if you do have questions, please stick them in the Q&A. I will endeavor to answer them if there's time. If there isn't time, we will answer them via email, or well, how you can contact your representative from CDW, and they can get them to me and I can answer them specifically. Okay. All right, let's kick things off. So we're going to start today just covering off a couple of things that are going to come into focus when you're doing investigation. So I want to cover off really the anatomy of an attack, and I'm going to try to simplify things just a little bit here so we can walk through. So as we're investigating, you can keep a couple of things in mind, okay? The first thing to focus on is that when it comes to cyber attacks, it is always all about the data. And we've seen a huge uptick in data breaches or exfiltrations of data that's come out of our recent security study that was just launched today or the other day ago. Specifically, it is about the data. Now, sometimes that data is going to be theft or extortion, so that would be an attack against confidentiality. Sometimes it's in terms of availability, so it's a denial of service. Maybe they're trying to do some encryption for ransomware. Sometimes it's focused on data tampering, signal manipulation, and what have you. But at the end of the day, the target is always going to be the data. And again, sometimes that data is going to be sensitive data on a system in terms of how things operate or execute. So when we're looking at an attack, we want to focus on the fundamental components. Now, there's a lot of information out there on how you can investigate attacks. Most people are familiar with the Lockheed Martin attack kill chain. I like to simplify things down really into 5 key attack components, 4 of which really we can influence, and one, honestly, we afford attackers, which is the time component. But let me just go into it first. So first and foremost, every attack needs some sort of form of vector, right? So a way in, whether that's into your organization, into an endpoint, into a cloud, doesn't really matter. They need a way to get in and a way to get out if they're exfiltrating data, for example, or a way to move laterally within your environment. So we refer to those as vectors, and common vectors, which most of you are probably familiar with, would be the internet, the network, email, USB, physical, quite honestly, if you leave the front door to your offices unlocked as an example, those are all vectors. So how an attacker is going to get in, move laterally, and get out. The second thing every attacker is going to need, or every attack is going to need, is an endpoint. Now that can be like a user endpoint, like a PC or laptop. It can be a server or a container. It can even be an individual. It's something that's actually executing the attack itself, right? So I'm just colloquially referring to that as an endpoint. I know we most usually view endpoints as devices, but again, they can be people as well, and they can be servers, and they can just be actually functions. So they need something to actually execute the attack. They also need an identity, because everything on a system needs an identity in order to execute. Now, sometimes that identity is going to be an individual user. Sometimes it's going to be a managed identity, like a system identity, for example, but it does need an identity. And lastly, it needs privilege, right? So that identity needs to have access to either sensitive data or sensitive systems, a way of breaking the access model that you might already have within the systems today, right? And that is how they continue to, and you'll see this repeatedly kind of over again, where, an attacker is going to come in, they're going to target an endpoint, they're going to assume an identity, and they're going to elevate privilege, move laterally, and do the same thing kind of over and over again. Now, these are the 4 components that systems really like. The systems like Defender or Sentinel are really focused on identifying. Defender calls these entities. Well, in some cases entities, in some cases it just highlights things like in privilege, but they're all there for you. So as you're going through and investigating an instance, you can see and start to make note of these various different components. Now, that last component, again, it's the one that we afford attackers, and that's time, right? The longer an attacker is in our environment, the more damage that they can do. And quite often, and you'll see this a little bit today, once we've resolved a particular incident, and we've collected all the information, we believe we remediated it, we've got to go back and make sure they are fully out of the environment. If they're still in the environment, we are affording them more time, and then again, they can move laterally through the environment and re-execute their attack. So by way of example, I'm just going to use Sandworm as an example of how that attack flow kind of works and how we can track these things as we go through in terms of those kind of 4 key components, right? The vector, the endpoint, the identity, and the privilege. So in this particular attack, it all starts from the outside with a vulnerability scan and basically looking for a vulnerability and deploying a web shell that basically introduces a reverse shell back. So basically a backdoor in. And as you can see within this particular example, up in the right-hand corner there, we've identified here, there's the vector here is the inbound internet through a vulnerability, right? It is targeting specifically the endpoint of a web server. The identity that it's operating under is currently web admin, and it's gained root privileges, right? So it's done that elevation to move over first user and then privileged up, escalated its privilege to gain root. Once it's on that particular on that web server, this particular attack moves laterally and it moves into the internal network. And again, in this case, that vector is actually the inbound network between the DMZ and the internal workstation, right? In this case, it's targeting a development server on the inside, right? And again, its identity is web admin and domain user. And right now it's using the privileges of of user and local admin. So it's found an account on that workstation. It has up its privilege level to admin so it can launch the next stage of the attack. It then moves laterally again, in this case using the internal network as the vector. It's targeting the domain controller in this particular instance, right? Operating as domain user and domain administrator. So it started as a local admin. It has then found the credentials and it has increased its privilege, assumed the identity of the domain administrator, and has full domain admin access. And from there, replicates laterally again, searching for connected hosts. Again, that vector is the internal network. The endpoint at that point is all these various different workstations operating as domain administrator. Now, this whole attack is a very complex and advanced ransomware style of attack, right? So that's kind of the process that you're going to see a lot of these attacks unfold. Now, this one is a lot more complicated than what you'll likely experience in your environment, and certainly more complicated than what we're going to see with Defender. But what I'm trying to point out is as we go through each stage of the attack, we want to make sure we're identifying those 4 key components, right? The vector, the endpoint, the identity, and the privilege. If we can kill or contain any one of those elements, right, we're much more successful in containing the attack. Now, ultimately, we want to contain all of them, of course, right? But if we can contain an endpoint, for example, which is currently being used as, let's use in this example, the workstation right in the center there in the internal network. If we're able to contain that particular endpoint before the attack can move laterally, we've effectively stopped the attack in its tracks, right? If we can prevent that identity privilege escalation or the assumption of identity, again, we can kill that attack. So that's what we want to focus on while we're looking at Defender and a particular incident. We're going to go through, and as we go through, I'll make note of the various identities, the various endpoints. Well, it's actually the one point endpoint in this particular case, and the vectors in which these attacks, or this particular attack that we're going to walk through, go in. And I'm going to walk you through how you might want to go about investigating that particular attack. Okay, so I'm just going to pivot over to my browser here. So what we're seeing here on the screen is basically the starting page. Actually, I'm going to maximize this just to make it a little bit easier. Let me just kill the presentation. There we go. Okay. So when we first come into Defender, if you come into the home page, you're going to see kind of an overview of all the capabilities that Defender has in it and notifications, like a dashboard. And again, what we're going to focus on today is the instance and investigating an incident. There are way more capabilities included within Defender, and there's not time to go through them today. We are just focusing on an incident investigation, but we'll touch on a number of them as we go through. But we're mostly going to focus on instance. Now, the first thing to be aware of with Defender, which is one of the really cool features, is that what Defender does for you on your behalf is it is going to correlate signals, threat signals, or telemetry from multiple different sources, much in the same way that the panacea of SIM was really supposed to do. So it's going to correlate all those different events and alerts down and put them into single, or in this instance, as you're seeing on the screen here, multiple investigations. Which means that when we actually go in to take a look at an investigation, and I'm just going to expand it out here for a second, we can see all of the alerts and all the activity associated with this particular incident. It also gives us a higher degree of confidence that this is not a false positive, because what we're seeing here is a collection of various different types of signaling, threat signals, telemetry, that are going to highlight whether or not something is a true incident or not. Now, obviously, in this case, we're doing some testing here, but I think you get the idea. The point is that what Defender gives you the ability to do is to focus on instance rather than just focusing on individual alerts. Now, one of the things I want to say before we actually dive into the incident, just so that everybody understands, because you're going to see a lot of stuff allowed to happen on our machine here that normally would never get through all of the defenses. So just to be clear, we have turned off safe attachments. So one of the vectors that this attack has come in is through email. We've turned off antivirus real-time protection. We've turned off script execution, or the prevention, I should say, of script execution from PowerShell. We've allowed macros to run uninhibited, unsigned within the environment. So normally you're not going to see any of this, any of these attacks actually being successful. But of course, to to give the example, we had to downgrade the environment a little bit. But it is important to note that if you turn certain features off, if you don't have a secure configuration, if you're not using attack surface reduction rules, for example, if you're turning off antivirus or you're creating exclusions and exceptions for certain folders or whatnot, if you're turning off automated investigation, you are exposing yourself to the broad strokes of an attack that Defender leverages to protect your environment, right? So for example, to quarantine a particular piece of malware that maybe the system has found, it's going to use antivirus to do that. And if you've turned off antivirus, you kind of lose that ability. So I just want to map that out just before we kind of dive in here. All right, well, let's take a look at this investigation, okay? And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly just kind of pivot over. I want to show you an older investigation. This is one that was run earlier yesterday, just to kind of highlight exactly how complicated these types of attacks can be and what you can see when you first go into an instance. So there's this concept of which Microsoft refers to as the attack story. And you can actually play out this particular attack story live, which is really, really handy as an investigator, especially when you're trying to wrap your head around how did an attack unfold, especially if you're mid-investigation, right? So in this particular instance, this instance that we're looking at has actually already been remediated, but assuming it wasn't, right? And we wanted to see what happened. We can actually leverage, I'm just going to move this over, we can actually play out the attack and watch as it unfolds, right? And start taking a look at the various, and we can pause at any time, by the way, and walk your way through them back. But you can see how that attack unfolded over time, right? Which is going to get, especially if it's a long standing, if somebody's been in your environment for, a few days to a few weeks and they're moving laterally and it's a much bigger attack than what we're seeing here, you're going to be able to walk through that attack story, right? And see exactly how that attack unfolded. Where did it start and where did it end up? Okay. Now, in this particular example that you're looking at, you can see there's multiple people affected here. It did come in through an email. There's multiple accounts. There's multiple mailboxes affected. There's only one particular endpoint that we're seeing that's affected by this particular attack. Obviously, it's a staged attack in this case. Normally, you're going to see more, especially if it's something that's spread, you're going to see more endpoints affected there. And I will go through all the kind of tabs on the top with the investigation that's running currently today, or the incident that's running currently today, just to kind of walk you through that. But I just wanted to give you an understanding of what this might look like when you've got a little bit more of a complex attack. Okay, I'm just going to switch over here. Let's dive into this one here. So this is the attack that's currently ongoing. So we launched this attack this morning, and it's very similar to the attack that we had just seen. I'm just going to realign things here. Now, in this particular case, it's only a single user and a single machine. You may see this live over time because there is currently an automated investigation going, and that automated investigation is going to look at other incidents that have come in. It's also going to look at some of the other policies where we may have sent, so we may have set for some users where maybe we've sent that email to, and it's eventually going to correlate them, and you're going to see more users affected by this particular attack. Now, you may see that live today. It's another reason why I wanted to show you that other incident, because that investigation, the auto investigation, had already run. One of the cool things about the attack story, and it's a recent change with Defender, it's only been live for about 5.5, 6 months now in its current form, is it gives you a lot of information that you can look at right here, right, to start your investigation. And a lot of times this may be where you spend most of your time. It's something really a very complex kind of attack, multi-stage attack like this, probably not, but in general, it's probably where you're going to spend most of your time. You can get a lot of information just from this screen. Not just with what you're seeing. If you click on any one of the alerts that are in the attack story here, what you're going to see is it's going to pivot down. I'll just move this over, and now you're actually in the full process chain. So if you wanted to, you could walk all the way back and all the way through to see exactly how an attack unfolded right at the process level. Now you can do this through the alerts as well. I actually prefer that if it's a very complicated or complex attack like this. I like to see it on a bigger screen. I'll get into that in just a second, but you can see right here, if you wanted to just take a look at a quick event and scroll on down, you can actually see exactly what has happened, how the attack was launched, and various details about techniques or tactics, the types of files used, and the specific alert that was generated as a result. Okay. You can also, let me just close that down. You can also from here, if you wanted to, start to pivot and get information about the various components of the attack, right? So we talked about the identity as an example as one of those components. You can come here and you can get the user details, right? As I wait for it to load there. So we can see in this particular case how many incidents are associated with this user, right? We can see if they've got any lateral movement pass. In this case is no, which is good. The various locations. We can see details specifically around the contact information. We can also pivot if we wanted to off to the user screen and get more details about that user. We'll do that once we get into sort of the investigation and the evidence pieces there. We won't do that right now. You can also get information on the file details as well. So any of the files that have been identified as potentially being malicious, right? The various details, whether or not it's been signed, the various hashes, if you wanted to go hunt for those, the prevalence within the organization, where it's been seen and where it was seen worldwide. If it's something that's unique to you or your environment, which you're probably going to see more and more, a lot of malware is being just, randomly, or not randomly, sorry, is polymorphic. It's going to be crafted and unique for each attack. So you may just see it, but you'll see similarities and you'll be able to view those in this page as well. And you can also take a look at some of the processes, right? So all the process details specifically for the processes that were found to be suspicious, right? All from this page, including if you wanted to punt off to VirusTotal and get a verdict on a file or whatnot. And again, through each of these, you can move. I can go to the file page, I can go onto the device page, and I can go specifically getting the device details and then pivot off to the device page as well, which we will do at a later time. But it's going to give you an idea of all the information that you might need to start your investigation, and in some cases actually conclude your investigation. The other thing that I do like about this particular view is you can use it as the autoplay, or you can actually just step through that attack back and forth and see what unfolded. Again, so you can see in this instance where it all originated from, and just to make note, this investigation is still ongoing. There's an auto investigation running. If we switch very quickly back to the other page, you'll see it a little bit different. You're seeing it actually came from that malicious attachment because it's already done that correlation. And you can see how that attack unfolds eventually. And again, you might see it live here when the investigation completes. And it takes some time to correlate all that information. You may actually see that play out here. So a very, very handy tool. Now, about 6 months ago, if you were using Defender, where you would have landed on initially is the summary page. So before they had the attack story. This is also a very handy page. To be honest, I kind of prefer it as my starting page rather than going straight to the attack story, because it gives me information that I need kind of right out of the get-go, right? It's going to tell me all of the various devices and users that are impacted by a particular incident. It's going to give me all of the additional information around related incidents, which is really handy. I can still see that same kind of attack timeline here with the various alerts down the side. I can get a high-level summary of the types of tactics and techniques that were used within the environment. I personally find this a great place to start the investigation. You can also very quickly pivot here. So you can pivot off into the assets by clicking either the tab up here or down here. You can pivot off to all the entities. So this is everything that was found to either be clean or malicious. You can even pivot straight from here if you wanted to up in the top to see the investigations. But this page I find very, very handy as a starting point, particularly when we start looking at the alerts and the types of tactics and techniques that were used. Okay. So I'm going to pivot back to the alerts. Or actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot into the alerts. And I'm just going to sort by first activity here. Okay, when we first saw this activity happen. So the alerts page gives you a list of all of the alerts in this particular attack that have been correlated. Okay, so under an instant. Now, if you've got an investigation running, and I'm actually just going to back up here for a second. I just want to highlight a couple things here. We have a couple incidents that are actually ongoing at the moment, and they have not yet been correlated into a single instant. Specifically, we have this, which is a custom detection that we've written for PowerShell detecting downloads from PowerShell. So it's a custom detection that we wrote that will eventually be correlated by the auto investigation into the this multi-stage incident. If it isn't, we actually can link that. So we can actively link incidents within. In fact, maybe I'll go through and I'll kind of demonstrate how you can do that. But you can link incidents that you know through your investigation are related. Now, in this case, it's pretty easy. We see it's the same user. We also see that it's the same endpoint. You could link them right here if you wanted to, but often this can be a little bit more complex. We also see we have another multi-stage incident, right? Now, this is an incident, again, that's the one that we were looking at previously, that we had already resolved. The auto investigation had run, antivirus was turned back on the device, and everything was quarantined. But now we've got another attack on that same device. Over time, you will see these incidents be correlated together, and some of the incidents, or sorry, the alerts within the resolved incident may actually be reopened if Defender detects it is a similar attack, or if it's leveraging sort of the same capabilities and whatnot. All right. What's really handy, and I told you I would go into this, what you could see in the attack story when you click on the individual alerts, it'll kind of pivot you into this process tree. To me, this is a much handier view for when you're doing these investigations for long term, just because you can make it so much bigger, right? Now, when you click on that alert, it's always going to give you the context, right? So in this instance, we clicked on that alert. What we're looking at is the process tree for this particular device with this particular user, right? You will see, particularly in the case of shared machines, you may see multiple users on the same machine. You may also see multiple users. When you click on the individual alert, though, it's going to give you the context of the machine and the user, which is very, very handy. Okay, I'm just going to expand this out again. What I love about this view is you can do a full trace back of the incident right from where it started. Okay, in this case, it was Explorer that was used to launch a particular Excel file, which ran a macro, which created and forked off a bunch of PowerShell processes, which then forked off again more PowerShell processes. And you can kind of see that all here, which is very handy, right? You can trace it all the way back if you wanted to where it started. You can also go all the way to the end if you wanted to, and start taking a look at everything that kind of happened on this particular endpoint under that particular user context, right? And again, keeping in mind those components, right? So as you go through and you're investigating that instance, you're going to be thinking about things of, okay, well, what was the vector? Well, in this particular case, because we don't know yet with this investigation that it's come through email, but we do know that Explorer was used to launch the Excel, right? The malicious Excel file. So in this case, it was a piece of malware that is serving as that vector, right? We can see that we know that it's executing on the endpoint, in this case, that Surface machine. We also know the user in particular, so the identity that it's operating under, which is really, really handy. If we go into the alert, and I've just got one up here for it because it makes it a little bit easier to see. I just want to pivot quickly. When we go through the alerts, we can see that that this particular attack did do some privilege escalation, and we can see that here. So we can answer a lot of those questions that I just talked about before, in particular stage of an attack. What was the endpoint? What was the vector? What was the identity? And what was the privilege? And most of that you're seeing right on the screen here. We can see that the token elevation here is full. That basically means this was a fully privileged user, so that's this particular command was executed as a privileged user on the device. We know, of course, that we're talking about that particular endpoint, and the user in this instance, you can see it here, is the user Alice victim, right? And we can see the process that in this instance that initiated this particular command. So you can actually get a lot of that information right from this view when you click into each one of these individual alerts. Right now, what's really handy about this as well, I'm going to maximize this again. I'm just going to expand all because I want to show you guys the level of detail that you can get. Now, keeping in mind, I shouldn't say never, you're not normally going to have to go to this level of detail in investigating an incident, particularly one that has been remediated. You should, make sure it's been remediated, but you're not necessarily going to do this for every single incident that comes in, but particularly for, critical incidents that have come in, multi-stage attacks, things where it looks like an attacker has moved laterally within your environment, you're going to want to go to this level of detail. And it gives you basically not just the chain of events and the series of processes and files that launched each other and are related, but it's actually giving you additional information like the PowerShell commands by way of example, right? So within this, if we go, and I'm just going to very quickly walk through, we can see that Excel kicked off a PowerShell. It looks like in this instance, what we've actually kicked off is a PowerShell file. So a PowerShell file is, PowerShell script has been saved to the device and then been run. That particular PowerShell script in turn ran another PowerShell script, which created effectively, and you can just highlight this here, it effectively has created a backdoor. So that's kind of like that backdoor, the Trojan, if you would, and dropped it on the device. So in this, we know kind of just by following this chain, we had an Excel file that had come down. It effectively ran a macro to download and run a PowerShell script, which in turn ran another PowerShell script to give an elevated user access. And then it just went to town. And you can see all of the different commands that particular PowerShell ran. In this instance, actually creating a particular, you can see it here. This shows that file creation. It's actually creating that backdoor and establishing that connection. And then, the attacker's kind of off to the races. And again, you can see how each one of these processes and associated files spawned additional processes to basically continue on that attack. And within this particular example, we've done a lot of stuff. We've added some persistence methods there, some scheduled tasks. We've changed file associations. There's been an attempt to create an account and elevate it. So a lot of stuff going on. And it gives you, again, that full ability to walk all the way back through that process tree. Now, you can go even deeper, and we'll do that in just a few minutes there in terms of seeing everything else that maybe happened on that device that maybe Defender didn't associate directly with an instant, but you might think is suspicious, right? So once you think the incident is resolved, or even before you think the incident is resolved, but you want to dive deeper because you're thinking as an investigator, this looks like it's a little bit more complex. It looks like it's a little bit more advanced. Let's dive deeper. And we'll do that in just a few minutes there. Okay, so that was in terms of the alerts that we were looking at here. Now, each time you get one of these instances created, there are investigations. These are auto investigations that are launched. Now, just a word about the auto investigations. There are different levels of auto remediation that you can set for the auto investigations. The recommended best practice, and is what we recommend here at CDW as well, is just to allow Defender to remediate everything, right? So it's an auto remediation. Now, it doesn't mean that Defender is going to quarantine every file is going to take care of every threat for you. You do need to do that investigation. You do need to make sure that threats are fully contained and fully remediated, but it's going to take care of a lot of the legwork for you. There's also a setting that is basically a semi-remediation. So it's still going to do the investigation. It's going to highlight things for you to potentially kill or quarantine or whatnot, but it's going to require approval first. Again, not recommended. You should always go with full, but if you have to, maybe you've got an old web server or whatnot, and you're a little bit concerned, you can require sort of an approval before things are killed or quarantined or whatever the case may be. The last is no auto remediation, which in my opinion should never be used because it basically kills your ability to do anything other than a manual investigation. And that includes quarantining the device, so doing a network isolation, for example, running a live response so that you can take a look and investigate directly on that device. Run that auto investigation, you lose those abilities. You're basically at that point just in audit mode. It's letting you know things are going on, but it's not doing anything about it. And it's not kicking off those investigations. Okay, I'm going to quickly pivot into the investigations just so that you can see. Now, in this particular instance, it has gone through and I've kicked off a couple of investigations and it hasn't found any threats, which is kind of weird because, we've highlighted here with the attack story that we actually had somebody in the environment. So if we actually go into these instance, I'm just giving a second here to go in, we can actually start to take a look at the alerts that were associated with the instance and what evidence was collected. Now, in this particular case, this is one that I just quickly generated, right? So you can at any time go onto the device and run an auto investigation. This would typically be done if you're doing threat hunting, for example, and you've seen something suspicious, and so you want to run an auto investigation on a device, or maybe you're not happy with with how the investigation unfolded, or maybe you didn't get to the incident for a few days and you want to see if there's still something going on there. It's a very quick and easy way to you just simply launch the auto investigation, and it's going to examine a whole bunch of entities and it's going to review them here. Okay. Now, in this instance, what we can see, right, from the evidence of this one investigation, we've got a couple of files that were identified, or in this case, a file that was identified as suspicious, a process that was identified as suspicious, right? And we can come down and take a look at some of the IP addresses that were involved in the attack. Now, the one thing to note when we start talking about auto investigations and when it looks at threats, it's largely going to be based off of known threats, not the behavioral threats. And that's an important distinction to know, right? One of the reasons we're seeing this as an incident be generated is because it wasn't a known piece of malware that came down like or a known Trojan. It's not like Mimikatz was run to scrape files in this particular case. It's a series of behaviors. So really behavioral analytics, the looking at the full data recording on the device in this particular instance, that's bubbled this up as an incident. But your investigations are going to look for pretty much known threats. Now, sometimes you're going to see threats that are seen as suspicious in this list, particularly when we start talking about the files, for example, and which ones are suspicious and which ones not. So this is a good example. It's seen one. So through the course of the investigation, what Defender has identified is this particular executable called Evil Dude has gone off and it's done a bunch of things, and it's been a chain of events that has basically signaled that this is probably a suspicious or malicious executable, and we should probably do something about that. So you'll see that as well within the scope of the log here. Suspicious but not confirmed malicious, right? That's your job as an investigator to confirm that being malicious. You can look at all the processes that were examined as well as part of the investigation, all the services, all the drivers, all the persistence methods that were used, okay? And again, when it's talking about persistence methods, just to be clear, there's a lot of things that are going to happen on your device. And you'll see this when we get into the device history or the timeline, where Defender has gone through and tagged events on the device that happen to be suggestive of an attack, but not necessarily. They could be legitimate processes, but can often be used as a tactic or technique. And they've actually flagged it, which is actually very, very cool. And we'll pivot off to that in just a second, just to kind of see where that goes. All right, but you've got that kind of full details around what was looked at as part of this investigation. And again, we've seen 3 investigations here. Another really cool feature that I think is really, really handy is you can see exactly how the investigation unfolded. This is particularly handy if sometimes you'll see a notice here as opposed to complete. It's going to see either in progress or it's going to say waiting for device, and you'll be able to see what stage of the auto investigation it's either stopped on, waiting for the device, or it's currently executing, which is very, very cool. And you can get details in terms, if you wanted to, around exactly what happened with that particular stage of the investigation. Again, that's the auto investigation. If I go back to the main the main incident there, you can see with this particular example, there were actually 3 investigations that were launched, right? One where an investigation was started manually, actually started it twice here, and one where it was automatically started as a result of a particular alert. So when certain alerts come in, auto investigations are going to kick off automatically. Now, all of the results from those auto investigations and the alerts are going to be collected here for you to see. So this is all of what we refer to as the evidence, okay? And you can see in this instance, we have 32 entities, right? So, and you're going to see, again, getting back to kind of what we were talking about before, the vector, the endpoint or process, you won't actually see the identity here, but you get a lot of that information. Although if you click into each one of these, you'll be able to see that. If I just quickly click on the processes here, you can see in this particular incident, we have a bunch of suspicious processes. Some of them can very well be legitimate. Bits admin, for example, we're going to have to click into that and see exactly what happened. This looks like it may be a legitimate file. If we want to scroll down and just get details on it, we can see some details around that particular incident, right? Who the signer is. So this in this case is a legitimate executable. It's a legitimate file and process that was running, but used in a nefarious way. Whereas if we take back just a very quick look again at the evil dude, which is that piece, that Trojan that we referred to earlier, we can see here, even though it's not on VirusTotal, it is associated with a number of events, and that it is not signed. It's an unsigned file. It is unknown, probably something that we want to take a look at maybe a little bit further if we want to pivot our investigation. From here, by the way, we can take certain actions, right? So in this instance, this particular executable that's running, we maybe, because it's suspicious, we maybe want to stop it and quarantine it, especially if we go back through the alert store there. If you recall, we did actually see kind of an outbound connection, and I'll get into that in just a second when we actually take a look at the device history there in the timeline. But we can actually stop this particular file and quarantine it right then and there. So we can not just investigate, but we can take actions, right? We also, if we wanted to, can go and hunt for this particular file. We can pivot actually off to the file page, and maybe I'll do that just now just to give you an idea. So we wanted to get some additional information on that file, right? So we can take a look at all, so this is all the deep information that we've got. We can see the various file names it's come in under, the various instance and alerts it's associated with. In this case, you can see that it's 2, where it's been seen in the organization. Right now, in this case, it's a single entity, or a single rather endpoint that this attack's been executed on. But if it's gone other places, you can also submit it for deep analysis, right? So that's going to send it off to Microsoft, where they're actually going to detonate that particular file. We'll go ahead and actually click that, and hopefully we get something back before the end of the session here. So you can get a lot of information again, and you can, that's just a straight pivot from where we were. You can do that from the URLs as well. If you wanted to inspect any of these, you can open the URL page and you can pivot off to there. You can see it's again, its prevalence. Same thing with any files that have come in. So it gives you the ability to, again, take, in this instance, take information directly from the evidence and then pivot into your investigation and take actions if necessary. Okay. That's the IP addresses that we're seeing there. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this IP address for just a second. So we know we've got a suspicious IP address. We actually have 2 here. One, of course, is a local, so it looks like it's looking up to the local IP address there with the 127. But we do have an external IP address which is suspicious. Now, if I go ahead and click on this one by way of example, right, I can see where it's actually coming from. So this one is actually hosted in Amazon, coming from the city of Columbus, which is kind of handy, right? And I can see whether or not, when it's been seen in the last few days, I can again pivot off to the IP address if I wanted to. I can add it as an indicator to take a look at it, right? I can even investigate it in the activity log, if and that's a link into Cloud Apps or Cloud App Security, if we've seen any activity associated from an application perspective with this particular IP address. Now, we're not going to in this case, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that. Okay, so let's go back to the alert story here, okay, and let's just kind of take a look at where we're at. So it looks like we've got a number of things. This incident has evolved while we've been sitting here talking, and it looks like we've got a number of things that have been resolved, but obviously a lot of alerts that we're going to need to take action on. We're going to need to investigate, right? So let me just actually wrong one there. I'm just going to move it into the first activity just so we can see it in chronological order there. Okay. So if we were just going to run through this chain, and obviously I know this attack because I'm the one who launched it, but as you're looking through the events, you're going to want to maybe prioritize certain items of the investigation and highlight what those are first. Now, a lot of organizations or a lot of investigators are going to want to start with what are considered the most severe alerts and actually take a look at what's going on there, right? We see here that there was a possible attempt to steal credentials. That's usually pretty important, right? So we're probably going to want to pivot onto that in terms of prioritizing our investigation. But we also have a different view that we can look at that's going to lean towards maybe a better approach to prioritizing our investigation. That's going to be with the assets page. Now, in this particular case, we only see one device, and that device has a high risk level. But if this was a multi-endpoint style attack where, let's say, it's on 20 to 50 endpoints within your environment, you're going to see them listed here. And there's going to be different risk levels associated with each of those devices, allowing you to prioritize which devices are the most important. You can also tag them. So in your environment, let's say you had, I don't know, your Active Directory directory server, or maybe it was like your e-commerce server and it was running Defender for server, which would bring events into here, and it was highlighted there. You can tag that so that you know immediately when it's involved in an investigation, you know that's your crown jewels. That's where you're going to want to focus your particular investigation. Okay, same with users. When you come in here, actually, I'm going to go to the other instance instead because it's actually completed there. Let me just go over here and take a look at the assets. It just gives a little bit of a better story. We can see in this particular instant, we had 3 users that were attacked or were involved, I should say, or targeted in this particular instant. And it actually goes a little bit deeper than that, and I'll show that in just a second. But if I scroll over to the investigation priority, I can see that somebody here, in this case, it's this particular user, which is our little user 1 there, has an investigation priority of 10. So that investigation priority has been calculated based on that user risk score, right? So whether or not that user has done an impossible travel event, or their credentials have been stolen, or has access to sensitive data, so on and so forth. So this view with assets gives you a different perspective from just looking at the alerts, just looking at the attacks story that we saw previously. But now you can actually focus your investigation on the things that matter the most within your environment. In this instance, we have a user who's got access to sensitive data operating on a device that happens to be very, very risky. It's got a very high risk score. Now, assuming that you've gone through and you've done your investigation and you've resolved all of these alerts that have come through, you've unwound maybe some of what the attacker has done. If it's a relatively simple attack, let's say it's 3 or 4 alerts and it looks like it was contained, it's a Friday, have yourself a Coke, put your feet up, and you can enjoy your weekend. In this particular case, however, you see something that's this complex or something that's more broad and involves more devices and more users, your job is not done yet. Just because you've resolved the alerts does not mean that you have resolved the incident. You do need to sometimes go a little bit deeper, and that's what we're going to do next. So I'm just going to quickly go over to the assets. Actually, I'm going to go back to this attack here, and I'm actually going to go to the assets and go to the device. Okay. And I'm just going to highlight this device. We're going to get information specifically on this device. Now, right away, when I've clicked on this device, I have some additional concerns, right? I can see that this device has sensitive data. So in this particular example, the Purview has gone through and it's classified some of the data on the device itself. And now I know that this particular device and this user thereby has access to sensitive data. That's my trigger that I need to figure out maybe what else has gone on while the attacker was in my environment. One of the great ways of doing that is taking a look at the timeline. The timeline is the full recording of all of the activity happening on the device, whether or not it was a malicious or suspicious event, or if it was just standard operating procedure. It is fully recorded, which is very handy, especially if you're going back and you're trying to investigate a low and slow attack. Maybe an attacker's been on that endpoint for a long period of time. In this particular case, let's just take a quick example. I'm just going to quickly pivot back to the investigation here and back to the evidence, right? Now, as we went through the evidence, we identified that we actually, oops, sorry, I'm in the wrong, am I in the wrong one? No, I'm in the right one. We identified that we had a suspicious process that was running, a suspicious file that was creating a backdoor, right? We saw that communication that was going back and it successfully established that communication. Probably a good idea to see everything within the timeline that particular process or file has done. So we can actually do that from that timeline, which is very handy. So I'm just going to pivot back over and just do a quick search. Now we're searching on the device in the device's timeline for all the history associated with this particular executable, right? There's a lot there, right? There's a lot there. If we want to scroll all the way back in time, we can see it was I'll just keep going all the way back. We're going to be able to see that it originally started early this morning and then just kind of continued to go over time, continued to do things, right? Now, what's handy about this particular timeline view, I mean, this is a lot to go through. Right? It'd be a little bit overwhelming. I'm just going to maximize it here to try to go through, but you can start to pivot and focus your investigation a little bit, right? So we know that backdoor exe in this particular case created a communication, an outbound communication. Probably a good idea to see everything that it was talking to, right? You can filter that based off of the type of events. So in this particular case, I'm just going to very quickly pivot and filter on network events. Okay. And in so doing, what you're going to see come up when it finishes loading is all of the network connections or communication that this process was operating under. Now, it is going back in time. It's going quite a bit, so it's going to take some time to load here. Okay, so what we can see very quickly on the screen here is you see that outbound connection that's happened here. You can see where this is in this case a failed connection, where we know it successfully established that connection before to this IP address, and we saw that IP address in the auto investigation. We had already identified that as suspicious. What we didn't see was this IP address, right? So this particular process has either directly or indirectly, by spawning another process, created another connection outbound. Now we've got to figure out what it's doing. Okay. The good news is we can actually see that just by clicking onto the various timeline items. If I take a look at this timeline item, when I bring it out, that fly window comes out, I can see very quickly under the entities, I can see that PowerShell, which was the original executor, launched this evil backdoor service, which launched PowerShell and connected to this IP address, right? That's a pretty significant find there. We now have a successful connection outbound. Again, it was at a high level of privilege. It had access. We got to kind of figure out what's going on as a result of that. What we can do is we can actually flag this, right? So this is now a notable event that we want to take care of, and I'm going to flag it not just for myself, but any other investigator. Maybe I want to turn it over to somebody later on because it's the end of my shift or whatever the case may be. But I can flag this event, so now that I can start to take a look and dive a little bit deeper. Okay. I'm just going to very quickly clear that network event. Okay, I'm just going to make note of the time here, right? It's 9:21:19. So let's go ahead and we're going to scroll back to that time because I want to see everything that happened that led up to that connection so we can get an understanding of what happened going forward. So we'll just quickly scroll down and looking for 9:29. I don't see it there. Let me just filter back just for a second there. We'll go back to those network events. Make sure I record that time better. All right, let's do that again. All right, I'm just going to copy that for a second here. All right. And now I'm going to go back and clear that out again. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the time range here. Okay, I'm going to leave it from this time here, but I'm actually going to set the end time because I want to see everything that happened right before that. So I'm just going to make that as a change, and we'll go to 59 just for fun. And we're going to look for that flagged event, and then we're going to try to look to see everything that happened leading up to that event. Okay, so let's see if we can find the flag there. As we're scrolling through, we can see the file associations were changed. Maybe I didn't flag that event. Let me just click on the flagged event and just filter basically only marked events and see if I can find it again. Maybe I recorded the time incorrectly. We're waiting for that to load. 9:21, I did have the time incorrect. I apologize for that, guys. Let's just switch that back up again. And we'll clear that flagged event off. And I went to 10, not 9. Okay, so we can see all the events there. Just scroll on down till we get to it. There we go. Okay, so there's where we've got that event flagged, that connection, and now we want to take a look at everything that's happened leading up to that, right? And if we go through each and every single one of these, what we'll see over time is that there was actually a successful connection attempt out over this, and you can see it's flagged here, which is really handy. So the original event that we saw where we were looking just for that connection, it recorded that activity. But just thereafter, it then established. So this is Defender establishing and tagging the next event as a potential suspicious process. So it hasn't identified it as suspicious, right? It could be just par for the course, but it's giving you the tactics and techniques that could be leveraged when actually when you're searching through these events. And you can actually filter on this as well if you wanted to see just all tactics and techniques. And we've got 5 minutes left, so I'll see if I can get through this and show that to you guys. But it gives you an idea of what happened. So in this particular case, it looks like we've got an outbound application layer protocol that's going to that IP address. It's on a non-standard port, right? And we can go through it again, see exactly what happened there over time. We can actually take a look at the command line that was leveraged here. It looks like in this particular case, we've got a net FTP request. So it looks like it's actually sending something, a specific package. This leads us to believe that this may very well be exfiltration. We probably want to do something about it. So now we've expanded our in this instance, we've expanded our investigation. So we probably want to make note of that. Now, from here, if we wanted to, and it would take some time, we can actually go and we can hunt for related events that may actually be doing the exact same thing. And actually, maybe I'll kick that off just so that we can do that. It's going to pivot into another page as well, and let's see what it comes back with. But it'll look for other types of events within that environment. And again, as we're scrolling through, if we keep going back in time, we can see all the things that happen. I'm going to make a note of a couple of other things that I've noticed here, right? We can see here that PowerShell was launched in that hidden window before. It's that backdoor process. And right before that, it looks like we've got files that were being created, things that have been read from the device and being created from that same executable. What that tells us is we likely have data exfiltration. So this is very common. You're going to stage something by copying it over to another directory, and then you're going to exfiltrate it out, like leveraging that vector. We saw the exfiltration. Now we have the ability to go through and start taking a look at what were all the different things that were looked at and exfiltrated. It's going to take time to obviously go through at a fairly granular level and investigate what happened as part of that incident. So again, we remediated the alerts. We thought we were fine, but then we figured out, wait a sec, there is another connection that was made. It was to a different IP address by the same malicious piece of software there. We've got to dig deeper. We've got to go to a deeper level here. Now I'm just going to quickly bring up the hunts there just to see if it came back with something. Oh, didn't actually run with anything in that particular case. Just hang on 1 second as we're waiting for it to return. By the way, from this page as well, from the device page is a really good example. Like we can take actions if we wanted to, right? Right on the individual PowerShell files in this particular instance, right? Evil backdoor, if I wanted to, and maybe I'm just going to go ahead and do this. I can, from this view as well, just go ahead and quarantine this device. I can add it as an indicator. I can go to submit it to deep analysis. I can hunt for that specific file as well. I'm actually just going to go ahead and stop and quarantine just for fun. And while it's doing that, let's go back to see if we got any results. No, didn't get any results from this particular query, so we're not able to find that particular. Oh, I stand corrected. Looks like we've got a lot of similar events associated with that exact same event that we just hunted for around creating files and exfiltrating them. So now and you can see the connection success. We can also see that this has actually gone back. If you keep going back in time, we're going to keep seeing this occur. And let me just actually scroll all the way back. Okay, so this particular attack that we're talking about was launched today, and we saw what it started at 9 o'clock this morning, but we've seen this actually occur before. In this case, it's in the same device because this is a simulated attack, but we saw it occur yesterday as well, right? So now we know our investigation maybe needs to pivot. It needs to pivot back maybe a little bit further. Maybe it needs to pivot to another device. Maybe we want to take a look at how this, who else may have been affected from a user status. So now we can start to do our hunting a little bit more. Again, we're talking about a very complex attack here, folks, in terms of what was executed and how we kind of pivoted with even just within that one device. But when you see that type of activity, those critical events, you're going to have to dive deeper to find out everything that happened. One last thing I want to make note before because I don't want to lose sight of this, and we've only got a minute left, so I'll just do this very, very quickly. When we looked at one of those incidents, I'll just bring it up here again, the one that had already been resolved. One of the things that we saw within the attack story Let's wait for that graph to load, is that we saw emails coming in. Okay, those emails that had come in were part of the delivery mechanism, right? So they were the vector. So we might want to pivot off into the email explorer and just kind of see, do we see those exact emails coming in, and did they go to any other users? And again, in this instance, we've turned off safe attachments for certain users, but we did leave it on for others. Okay, so if you just very quickly pivot to malware, what you can see here is we actually have a lot of similar emails that have come in, all by the same sender. In this case, that's the nasty evil CDW sender at Gmail. We can also click over to see whether or not the Defender believes this is subject to a campaign, and it looks like we actually have 2 campaigns that are currently targeting our environment. So this is going to help us pivot as well. A lot of this stuff has been caught, it's been blocked, but if anything has gotten through, we're going to be able to see it here, pivot over, and we may find maybe a user is using a device that doesn't happen to be running Defender for endpoint, but we do now need to investigate that device because it looks like the mail was successfully delivered, for example, with that attachment to that user. So it allows us to pivot kind of back and forth. All right, we are, guys, at 11:01. That took a little bit longer than what I had intended. So that concludes what we're going to go over today. The next in the series, we're going to be focusing on Defender in corroboration with Sentinel. So using those 2 platforms together to expand your investigation even further. I'll review a couple of other things specifically on Defender at that time, because we will leverage the same attack slightly different, so that we can see some of those other capabilities that you actually get from Sentinel by bringing additional data in and being able to enrich and expand your investigation. I appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you so much for coming. If you do have any questions that are not in the chat, you are welcome to email me directly. My name's David Azard, so it's david.izzard@cdw.ca. You can email me directly, and I will do my best to answer your questions. Again, everybody, thank you very much for your time. I very much appreciate it. Take care.